So one of the biggest concepts around the whole identity profile, which moves away from a single typing system, is to not only lean into the idea of what your most efficient number is going to be, your headquarters, your home base, the place that you go to sleep and you wake up every night and every morning. We know that's a part of who you are. But we also want to talk about what is the experience as a human being when you encounter a number that may be very low for you? And what is the difference in that relationship between somebody who expresses a number high or efficiently, or they express it low or inefficient? What does it look like for us to have conversations around what happens to you if somebody interferes with your highest number? And what happens if somebody introduces your lowest number? Does it trigger you in a similar way, or can it have a trigger? What does it look like to be really efficient and really strong and really effective in a high number, but then be struggling to introduce or to utilize that number if it's low for you? So long story short, this series is going to be about conversations in each of the numbers as it relates to when it's high for you, when it's low for you, how it impacts you if somebody interferes with that goal, or if somebody introduces that unfamiliar space. Thanks for joining. So let's talk about 5 energy. You know, when you think of 5, or most people say, oh, that person's got 5 energy, or that person is a 5, what comes to mind? It's the researcher, the investigator, the observer, the academic, the intellectual. Well, here's the thing. I'll tell you right off the bat at the beginning. The number one type that is attributed to me as a person is a 5 energy. And the 5 is my lowest number. So that whole idea of 5s being that particular space is kind of flipped on its head when it comes to my lived experience. And I think the reason I mention that up front is the 5 is one of the most important numbers for being able to say we cannot take binary approaches to what it looks like to be a human being. It isn't black and white. In fact, it's a lot of gray, and in fact, it's a lot of color, and it's a lot of texture, and it's a lot of nuance. So let's have a little bit of a conversation around 5 energy, and how in the world could a guy who wrote a book on the brain-based Enneagram and the neuroscience behind how this works be lowest in a 5? So to naturally move in a 5 space means you have the innate human capacity for investigation, sometimes called observation. And remember, I think it may even be an opportunity to introduce the idea of the 5 being more of a researcher, because to reconcile different groups of people who say it's investigation or observation, a natural researcher, or the natural process of a researcher, is to propose a hypothesis, to ask clarifying questions, to consider a new option for investigating, to investigate those routes or those particular ways of learning how the world works, to implement that, to step back and observe your findings, to do an audit, to go back and iterate and reverse engineer constantly and say, what is a way to not only reverse engineer my hypothesis so I can make it a theory, but once I have some more evidence, how can I continue to engineer better and better ways to innovate that space and to problem solve? Because those are the 2 wings of a 5. So a 5 is naturally going to investigate and then observe, and then investigate and then observe over and over and over again, because that's what the nature and the heart of research is. So it's both and then some, not either or. So yes, innate human capacity for investigation and observation as a researcher, because you're seeking clarity. Why is a 5 so good at clarifying questions? Because they're constantly inquiring. They're curious. They're inquisitive. It's the natural part of the left brain to ask those questions, to learn and want to know more, because they're gifted at insight. Insight is to see something other people don't see, to see new ways of doing things, to innovate, to problem solve. The challenge is sometimes those blessings of being a problem solver and an innovator, and to be able to see things other people don't see, and to have the capacity for all of the clarity coming to mind because you investigate and you observe. If it's overdone, or if it's unrestrained, now all of a sudden you're seeing things that other people don't see. And that can lead to paranoia or concern or obsessive compulsive natures. 5s are so gifted at asking questions and finding information, but here's the thing. If you're really high in a 5, trust me when I say this, you will never have enough information to achieve all of the clarity and the peace that you seek. Just like a 2 will never have enough love, a 4 will never have enough depth, a 7 will never have enough experiences, and a 9 will never have enough rest and solitude and stillness. It isn't about arriving at the destination. It's about experiencing the journey over and over again in healthier and healthier ways. But the 5, you can boil down to the space and the human experience where you ideate. You come up with those ideas. It isn't execution, that's a 1 energy. It isn't creativity, that's a 3 energy. It isn't imagination, that's a 4 space. But for you to ideate, and the ideate to have the clarity and the details of the mechanics and the process, that is a natural gift, and why 5s are so driven by increased clarity, even to the point of excess. So what does it look like to rein that in? And if you're high in a 5 and somebody introduces ambiguity, or they interfere with your ability to seek clarity, if somebody introduces incompetence, and now all of a sudden you don't have somebody that's working with you that's providing insights, how do you show up in that space if all of a sudden somebody goes, I'm going to make this more confusing and less clear? Take into consideration, if that's you, what that shows up as when that presents. So let's look at somebody who's low in a 5 energy. What does it look like if you don't speak 5 on a regular basis? If it's not something you're actively pursuing and trying to maintain as a daily experience? Let's use myself as an example. 5 energy and 5 essence and 5 capacity happens to be my lowest consistent way of engaging the world. I don't need it to be present on a regular basis. So why is it that I don't have to have clarity? I don't have to have the innovation and the problem solving be in my life on a regular basis? Is it because I had a childhood wound, or I had a negative experience growing up? Or is it because I just don't have a legitimate, real, tangible way of saying that's worth it? I want to invest my time and energy in that. For me personally, I went to 11 different schools before I graduated high school. My wife and I have moved 9 times in the 15 years that we've been married. I moved into a town called Mohawk, Tennessee, went to an elementary school called McDonald's that had never seen a person of color or an immigrant. So my experience with being in spaces that were consistently unclear. What does tomorrow look like? Are we going to have food from the food bank? Are we going to be able to have clothes from the angel tree because somebody donated us as twins a Mario and Luigi sweater pants outfit for our 9th birthday? I don't know what Christmas is going to look like. I don't know what next week is going to look like. I didn't have a lived experience with consistent clarity. I had a lived experience with consistent ambiguity and a lack of clarity because we were living day to day as immigrants who came to this country. So I didn't have the negative encounter with a 5 space that said, what does it look like to encounter really strict, focused, strong 5 energy? I just had a lack of 5 being worth investing our time and energy into because there were other things that were more important. So it's an example of that. But for instance, in my life, if 5 is introduced, how do I get triggered? As a clinician, one of the things that we have to do is be very, very focused on charting and documentation and electronic health records. And there are a few things on the planet that will drive me more up the wall than to sit with a patient who has been to 20 other providers, has no clarity on what's going on for them, and instead of talking to them, I'm typing on a computer having to fill out a chart. This is why when I work with people, I do not have a computer open. I'm present with them. Because as a strong 2 and a strong heart triad, my desire is to be in relationship with them and to understand in a compassionate and meaningful way what's happening in their life. I don't need to chart at that point. It's also why I'm not the best at taxes and I'm not the best at a spreadsheet. If I get into a space with pure data, just one-on-one, I can't have a relationship with that information. So to be by myself with that data is taxing. Case in point, to do the work like the brain-based Enneagram, to do the work like the research and understanding how to connect the dots, how to problem solve and innovate an entirely new process, like the whole identity profile, is fatiguing. So if you're low in a 5, going into the gym and exercising in that 5 space, we have to be conscientious as we engage in it, that when we introduce those spaces, it can be more fatiguing than we think. So to be able to do that in a technique like the Pomodoro technique, where I do 25 minutes on and 5 minutes off, can be a really helpful thing as I engage in purely data-driven spaces, absent of relationship and other human beings. So to finish the explanation of this 5 space for everybody, high or low, I want you to think about specifically with the 5s, because it's such a gift in terms of specificity and detail, that when that 5 also pulls in that adjective or that resource of the 4, now the 5 is driven by understanding, but it's saying, what are my feelings telling me? How can I innovate my own experience as a human being to allow that right brain heart space of the 4 to inform what my head is thinking? And the most effective way to understand what you're thinking is also to understand what you feel and what those feelings mean to you specifically. And then the 5 with a 6 wing, that's that problem-solving space to go, yes, I want that clarity, but I want that guaranteed clarity. That as that 6 leans in, now I'm strictly in a left brain space, I'm strictly in a head space, I'm anchored in that experience. And this is what it looks like to have guaranteed clarity so that as I problem solve, I can trust that information and I can rely on that clarity. So remember, as you move through a 5 space, if you're a 5 with a 6 wing, don't forget that you have a heart. And you need to lean into what it looks like to have those relationships in that gut-body-based space. Because if you're really heavily planted in that 5 space, it's going to be hard for you to show up in a body or a heart space because you live so squarely in your mind. And if you're a 5 with a 4 wing, take into consideration, man, it can be really confusing sometimes to be leaning in and back and forth because it can feel like a bipolar experience. All of a sudden it's a heavy thinking space and all of a sudden it's heart and it's feeling. It's a heavy thinking space and man, it's heart and it's feeling. So being able to go back and forth between those spaces, it's another helpful place to say you are a whole brain, whole identity, whole human being. So 5s especially can oftentimes have some of the most polarizing experiences as they connect to their own heart, but that 4 is a natural wing for that 5, so you can access it. It's just sometimes what does it look like to exercise that? And if you're low in a 5 space, like myself, and you have to sit in front of just the data, and somebody has to clarify something and set a boundary, 5 is a natural space in the brain that sets boundaries, sets the rules of engagement, and says this is the way that we are going to do policy moving forward, the idea of what that looks like. So if you're going to exercise it, if you're high in 5, maybe what does it look like to slow that racing mind down, to practice a bit of silence in your mind? And if you're low in 5, what does it look like to go, can I lean into the space of where I come up with new ideas? And how do I ideate? And how can I maybe just put down one thing that might be something that's coming to mind in a specific way that is relevant to my experience as a person today? A couple of things to think about. Thanks so much.